insurance market in Florida. I'm happy to say that that number is now down to below 800,000. So that's how we can tell that things are going the right direction.
So Brandon, one of the questions, just as you're starting off at the beginning, when they establish their policy, so some of our associations believe that if you switch carrier, if you switch your representative, so if they left Plastridge, if they're with you now and they have someone and they go out to the market, that someone else can go to other companies and bring in different companies than you all have access to. Can you clarify that so people understand how that works with your agent?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question and it comes up all the time. Obviously, there's I think this is one of those things that can be somewhat misrepresented, in that, an agent is obviously wanting to start working with an association, and that process, really the only time it makes sense to change from one agent to another is if you're dissatisfied with your current agent's service. We're a service business. Agents don't set the premiums. Insurance companies set the premiums. If you talk to an agent and they lead with they can get you a better price, to me, that's already a red flag, because they have zero control over that price. But really, when we are hired by an association, it's because they just don't feel comfortable with their current agent, maybe don't feel they've done the best job, are not responsive, don't give clear answers, whatever it is. But it's not because we brought in a cheaper option. We all fish in the same pond. Insurance agents all fish in the same pond. Excuse me. And that, and like I said, the insurance companies set the premium.
So one of the other questions that I hear a lot and I get frustrated myself with is the timing of letting the association know what their options are. I mean, I know when things were really bad last year,
Right.
we were days out and we were getting quotes that we had to run back to our boards and they had to make an immediate decision and we had to get checks cut, within 48 hours to pay. What is the time frame that realistically the boards can expect for you to bring back to them the different pricing? And should they expect that you're going to give them comparisons?
So I'm going to answer that, but I wanted to circle back quickly to that first question and just say, I want everybody to understand that signing an agent of record letter is not giving your association the ability to shop with another agent. It's literally terminating your relationship with the current agent and hiring this other agent. It's not so that they can go out and shop the market or get an alternative proposal. It's literally terminating one relationship and starting a new one. So moving on to the other question, the two things that are not in an agent's control are the premium that the insurance company wants for the risk and the timeline on when we get those premiums. So I will say that we experience the same thing. Obviously, we're in the same market as all the other agents, and we were getting quotes very last minute. Regardless of how much we hounded these underwriters, quotes were being released very last minute. That was a condition of a very difficult time in the market. And we've already seen that change with the market also changing for the better. We're seeing now that we're getting quotes 3 weeks, sometimes even 30 days out. But generally, I would say you should be able to have a renewal meeting with your agent 2 weeks in advance with no problem. But that was a very difficult, nobody liked doing business like that. And I can assure you that I was just speaking for our agency, we didn't enjoy it either. So.
Okay. What is the difference between an HO3 and an HO6 and why does it matter?
So these are called homeowners form 3, homeowners form 6 is the long version. There's a homeowners form 4. Homeowners form 3, HO3 is generally a single family home policy. Those are package policies. They include liability, loss of use if you have to move out of the home, They really provide a lot of broad coverages. So that policy is generally intended for like a fee simple structure, like a single family home, or in some cases a townhome.
But not a condo then.
Not a condo. So condos are very specific. HO6 policies are specifically tailored to condominiums. So in the state of Florida, those policies mimic Florida Statute 718.111, Section 11, which is the insurance section that kind of tells us all what's covered by the association versus what's covered by the individual owners of each unit. So an
So-
HO6 policy and the master policy for the association, those are going to work together in almost every claim scenario.
All right. We have a saying that what you're responsible to insure in a condominium association, in the event of casualty, you are required to replace, restore with limited exception. And that's a broad general rule. And we have I after E, except after C. The lecture, repairs, maintenance, restoration, casualties, everything you wanted to know and are too confused to ask, because it is such an interesting, strange analysis when you're trying to figure out, well, who's responsible to do the repair? So condos, just so you all out there know this, you could actually opt out of the provisions of 718.111.11 to follow the provisions that are in your declaration of condominium. But absent that vote of the owners, then you're following the statutory regime in the event of a casualty. And it does work out pretty good. For the most part, any owner improvements, well, that's going to be on the HO6 policy. Many parts of the original construction of the unit. And remember, when you buy a condominium unit, what are you buying? I like to joke when I'm teaching the board cert lectures, congratulations, you all bought a Cuba Air bounded by paint on the sides, maybe a floor covering on the bottom, and the popcorn ceiling on the top. Everything inside of that, that's what you got. So what do you really have when you have the condominium unit? Because the association is responsible, of course, for the common elements. And it's just a really interesting issue how those analyses are performed. Do you run into a lot of litigation on those types of issues, Brendan?
What we tend to see, Jeff, is when somebody chooses to not buy an HO6 policy.
Ooh.
And then, some people feel the only recourse is to then bring an action against the association. And usually it's an allegation of failure to maintain. The allegation suggests that the association could have and should have done something to prevent damage to the inside of that unit. As you know, those don't generally go anywhere. I mean, there's a lot of case precedents there. I mean, but we do see those. It's in the best interest of everybody involved to have that HO6 policy. But in the absence of it, they're usually the owner is going to come out of pocket for those repairs.
There was a period of time in the law where everybody that lived in a condo, it was very short-lived, as I recall, but you were required to have the HO6 policy. For reasons I don't know, maybe then the legislature took that requirement out. But doggone it, if I'm going to live in a condo, and one day, who knows, maybe I'll move to one.
Right.
The very first thing I would probably undertake to do, if they haven't done it already, is to do an amendment to the declaration to require every owner to have an HO6 policy, because of the owner isn't financially prepared. God forbid the owner is the one causation that causes the problem. My gosh, is putting all of his personal earnings at issue, right? In the forthcoming litigation, and
Right.
no insurance product on the back end to protect them.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I agree with you completely. I had a loss last year where there were 64 units damaged by a high pressure in a stack, but damaged by a high pressure fire sprinkler line.
Mm-hmm.
About half had HO6 policies.
So what happened then? Those owners then were responsible for the
Right.
items that the statute says they are responsible for. All the window coverings. Do you know the enumerated list off the top of your head? I'm actually pulling up the statute to read it out to everybody.
Yeah, there's about a dozen. It's the floor, wall, ceiling coverings, cabinets, fixtures, appliances, water. What is
Heater, I
it?
think it is.
Water. Yeah.
Got
And
it here. Curtains, drapes, blinds, hardware, similar window components. And of course, this excludes any owner upgrades, right? To like the
right.
original cabinetry, if it was installed by the developer, could be on the association. But if the owner upgrades that cabinetry, that's the I after E except after C exception, then that responsibility could fall actually to the owner. But if you haven't read 718, section 718 and you're on a condominium board, you absolutely should. Absolutely, absolutely. Just research 718 in Google and it'll pop up for you. You can go to the Florida Senate homepage, type in 718.11, and the whole statute will come up. Just scroll your way down to subsection 11 and give it a read. It's important for every board member to be thoroughly dialed in to that particular provision in the Florida statutes.
I do have good news for all of our friends on this webinar that do live in a condo or an HOA. Along with the association's insurance premiums coming down because of the market stabilizing and getting healthier, those policies, the HO6 policies or an HO3, those policies are also coming down and much more priced, much better than they were during the last 4 years.
I got thrown out of the state policy, Citizens, because there was another competing provider who was willing to
Sure.
offer me the insurance within what, 80% or within 120% of what the state
Yeah,
charges.
20. So 20%, you get kicked out if you're if they come in within 20%.
And guess what? It actually, my insurance actually went down about 15%. Same coverage with the new insurer, and it went down for about 15%.
So, in insurance, there's no friends and family discount. So at one moment, and my premium went up 34% in 1 year. So mine came down this year as well.
Yeah, we're seeing that across the board too, that a lot of the premiums are coming in less, which is very good going into budget season and renewals. But I have a question back on the insurance. So Jeff, in your opinion, do you think the buildings or the management companies should be tracking the certificate holders and the insurance for their owners and their buildings?
It's a nightmare to do that. There's no doubt about it. It wouldn't surprise me if a condominium association not only requires every owner to have the HO6 policy, but to provide a copy of it to the association through the management company. There's that page that seems to accompany the management agreements that lists out the extra costs when the management company has to send a demand letter, when they have to send a file over to the lawyer. Maybe that's something you guys want to think about, adding a fee component for a small one, but because it is such an amount of work for the manager to have to chase after everybody, then you have to let the board members know who doesn't have the HO6 policy. And if they don't have it now, depending on the language of the requirement, is the association now, is their hand forced and they have to seek an injunction to force the owner to get that HO6 policy? Lots to talk about in that process for sure. But if you're going to require the HO6 policy in the governing documents, then it only makes sense that a copy be provided to the association so that you know who has it and who doesn't. But then to administratively put that together every year, well, Marita, I'm glad that's why we have you and we have Lang.
Yeah. I will
Well,
say,
because my concern is if someone doesn't have it and it isn't tracked by anyone, where is that liability
Well,
going to fall?
has the board then breached a duty by not tracking it? And if the
Right.
requirement and then they let it go and they abrogated the requirement, that can create a whole nother bundle of problems.
Right.
well, to go back to your previous question, Jeff, about that moment in time when they changed the statute to require the HO6, that right there is exactly why in 1 year they had a glitch bill and they took that language completely out, because the original language in 2008 that amended 718.111 made the board responsible to police this, and then if they could not obtain a copy, they were obligated to go buy a policy and then try to collect from the owner that wouldn't previously show them a copy.
Sort of like a forced place situation.
Right. And as you can imagine, putting that on a volunteer board is crazy.
Right.
But
So,
that's why it's
Before we move a little further on, there was a question that came up when we were talking about the agents, and someone had asked, if you can't negotiate the insurance, Brandon, then what is it that you provide? Because you can't negotiate their insurance. So they really don't understand the role of the agent. If you
So
want to clarify that.
sure. Our role, and we're classified as a service in the service industry, because our service is not just going out in a lot of ways, the easy part is actually going out and getting the quotes. The hard part is making sure that we do all the other things throughout the year that come along with being at being your agent. So while we can't necessarily our skill sets don't include, like, beating up an underwriter to get a better price. They don't come in and say, how about 100 grand? And we're like, nope, 80. No, it doesn't work like that. This isn't a straw market. When they say 100, that means they've run their modeling. They've run it through the proprietary modeling, their catastrophe modeling, which is what they use to determine premium. And they've said, this is what we are willing to take the risk for. There is no scenario where one agent gets a better number out of that same risk. It's the underwriter says, here's what we're willing to do it for, and it either works or it doesn't. Or you go with a different company, I should say. So our value is making sure that we have accurate underwriting, which, there's a strong argument to be made that the agent that you have a 10-year relationship with has all this historical underwriting information that is very helpful. A new agent that, comes in, they don't necessarily have that same historical information. But that is, what our process is to get the information, make sure we have accurate information, which, is a lot more underwriting information than we've ever had to collect after the collapse down in Surfside. I'm collecting documentation that's
It's not only that, but just to add to that in a response. So I see what you put together and what you send over to us in comparing the different policies and the recommendations on it, that associations, you need that. You need someone finding the loopholes. If there is something in one of the policies that's different from another policy versus one of the board members or a committee member comparing all these policies back and forth, your agent's doing that for you and telling you if there's something. I mean, I remember when they came out with the cyber or the flood insurance or recommendations that you all come forth with, that's optional
that's right.
to an association.
That's right.
One of the things they also asked, the additional insured versus a certificate holder, if you could explain the difference in those.
Before we jump into that, if you don't
Yep.
mind, I just want to finish up with the HO6 policy and the condominiums to ask a question that has come up time and time again. The statute says the following: a unit owner is responsible for the cost of repair or replacement of any portion of the condominium property not paid by insurance proceeds if such damage is caused by the intentional conduct, negligence, or failure to comply with the terms of the declaration or rules of the association by an owner, the members of his or her family, unit occupants, tenants, guests, or invitees, without compromise of the subrogation rights. So the association might normally be responsible, and now we have a situation where we'll pick up on the negligence instead of intentional conduct, because that's probably a policy exclusion along the way somewhere for that type of conduct. But the owner was negligent, right? He made a silly, stupid mistake, and it caused the association itself hundreds of thousands of dollars of damage because the water ran all the way down the stack, we'll say. In that situation, would the HO6 policy help protect the owner in terms of coverage?
So the policy itself, the HO6 policy, does in fact have a line item for personal liability. Okay, so and this is this is personal liability, not premises liability. So it's not specific to a location. It's, I always tell people, you can be at Publix and you turn a corner because you're in a hurry and you bump into somebody and they fall and break their hip. Your homeowner's policy will defend you.
So
if
these
and
policies
when
are pretty light, right? I mean, light. They're not very expensive, the HO6 policies.
Right, they're not. So, and we live in beautiful South Florida, so it's not if you get sued, it's when you get sued, right? So the
So it's a smart
HO6
thing to have.
right. But to answer your question, we see these types of just clear negligence all the time, Jeff. And surprisingly, the association doesn't end up, or I should say, even the association's insurer, the association's insurer, almost all of them have a waiver of subrogation in the policy, meaning they're not going to pursue a
You're
neg.
going to have to explain. I mean, yeah, Marita and I know what that means.
Yeah, okay.
I have to
So
explain
the
subrogation in plain language to everybody out there in webinar land.
Well, so I'll give a quick story. This is a real story. So, absentee owner rents the unit. I think they were in actually even international. And the tenant sends 4 emails over the period of 3 weeks saying, "Hey, the water. Everyone, I get home from work, the water heater has a puddle underneath. I think you need to send a plumber." Owner doesn't do anything about it. Right after that, the water heater goes and the water travels to a wall that happens to have everybody's electrical panel for 16 stories.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Yikes.
So it ends up being around $1 million loss. But the master policy, the policy that covered that, like most policies that cover associations, has a waiver of subrogation, meaning they have given up their right to go after an owner of a unit that caused the damage. And I will tell you, I know some people might say, why would an insurance company want to waive their right to do that? And my response would be is you'd be crazy to live in a building and not have a policy that waives that, because I have seen people do some things that have caused millions of dollars in damage. And even if they have a homeowner's policy, your homeowner's policy has either 100,000 or 300,000 of liability. If the association pursues you for a $2 million loss, you're going to be in a bad spot.
Okay, and then there's a requirement in the statute, I believe, that says if the condominium association policy doesn't have the right of subrogation, then the owner policy should not have it either.
That's a very recent amendment to 718, and it was very, very much needed. As much as we all love our elected folks up in Tallahassee and that do this legislation, generally speaking, and I chaired the State of Florida Insurance Association and spent my fair share of time up in Tallahassee. Generally speaking, they are never in front of an issue. They are never in front of a problem. It's generally reacting to a problem. And in this case, it's never more true. We had a situation where one insurer, to go unnamed, was basically had built a machine and subrogated, which means this is an insurer that provides the HO6 policy or an HO3 policy. They pay their policyholders damage, and then they sue the association to try and collect from the association's general liability insurer.
Sounds like universal. I've had more of those come through than any other subrogation claims.
There was a moment in time where we were averaging 4 or 5 a week.
Wow.
So basically the legislation was changed. Statute 718-111 was amended, which now says that if the property policy for the association has a waiver of subrogation, then the unit owner's policy can't subrogate against the association's general liability policy. So
good to know. Is there I heard, and I haven't read it. I think one of our readers had a small question about that, and maybe one of the courts is looking, instead of a statutory right of subrogation, but like an equitable right of subrogation, so to speak, that'll have to be dealt with in the near future.
yeah, we're monitoring that just as a point of fact, because it's kind of anytime as I don't need to tell you, Jeff, every time legislation's created, somebody's going, water and air always finds a new path, right?
Right.
So, this is the newest attempt to sort of navigate around new legislation to stop this subrogation issue.
Interesting. Okay, I think we can now circle back to Marita's wonderful question about the differences between a certificate holder and an additional insured.
Sure. Yeah, this one's pretty easy. Certificate holder is really just to represent that the coverage is there. Okay, so generally speaking, when you start the process of, say, bidding out painting the building, during that, call it the RFP process, where you've requested proposals, you will likely have one of the items that's requested from the people that would provide a proposal to do this service would be a copy of their certificate of insurance. And on that certificate, it'll generally say certificate holder, because at that point, you haven't hired them, but you'd like to know what they have for coverage before you hire them. So that's a certificate holder. When they give you that, it doesn't represent that they're going to extend coverage to you if they cause a problem while they're working on your property, because you haven't yet agreed to hire them.
My understanding is it only gives me notice as if I'm a certificate holder, like my client is the certificate holder and the policy is going to lapse, then the certificate holder will get written notice of that. Is that the case?
Yeah, you can, exactly. It represents coverage and basically shows you the insurance companies they're working with, the coverage limits. That's kind of when you're just dating. But once you get married, you're going to want an additional insured status. You're going to want a certificate that specifically names the association as an additional insured. And the way that works is if let's use the painting the building, continue that example. Let's say that they don't use the right paint, or they don't do the right mixture of that paint, and it starts to peel off the building, or let's say they're on site and their scaffolding falls and damages several vehicles. The easiest path forward to try to collect from their insurance company, since they're the ones that caused the damage, would be to work around them and go right to their insurers. And the easiest way to do that is when you have additional insured status. That gives you access to their policy.
You know what I see on that as well is a multi-year project, because for the project is just going to take longer than a year, and some of these big concrete projects do. And nobody is minding the store of when that insurance policy is going to lapse. And it's really at the association level that needs to be done. We'll always point out in the preparatory phases, right? Once we're doing the contract and we have a wonderful construction contract that's been negotiated, requires the certificate holder. But if the policy of the contractor lapses in that, because it's been a year, and then you're not named again as the certificate holder, that can cause later problems. So associations, just helpful hints. You always want to make note when you're doing these projects and you are the additional insured, what's the date that policy lapses, and get it on your calendar so that about 30 days ahead of time, you're in touch with the contractor, reminding them you need to be the additional insured again.
Yeah. Yeah.
Jeff, we actually use a outside company, My Vendor Center, that we require everyone to register, and it tracks all that for the associations.
Nice.
Yeah,
Okay.
so that way it's one less worry for the association.
Is that a complimentary service that Lang provides? Is that a fee-based service? How does that work?
It's a fee-based service to the vendor. The vendor pays $100 a year to belong to myvendorcenter.com, but they have access to us and other management companies who are part of it that track it, and many companies are using that now.
Nice.
So the win for the vendors is that it's only $100 for them, and they have access to other bids. And for the association, they track the insurance, they track their any licenses they may need, whatever requirements we have on the association. So
And what's it called again?
myvendorcenter.com.
Love it.
I'm unfamiliar with that company, but it's interesting that it sounds like a great solution, because one of the things that I typically will do when I start a relationship with a new association, they've hired me, I've come on board, I'll do an audit of they all have a certificate folder, and it's usually like this thick, and it has certificates that might be older than me. in there still. And I'll go through it and I'll say, to help, as in a coaching way or in a teaching way, and we'll go through the certificates and I'll pull several out and say, well, do you see how they put this language here and they didn't check this spot here? It looks like you have an additional insured status, but because they didn't put this here, or they had this language, you don't. So we want to make sure we look for that, and so, and truthfully, I find many, many, many certificates that are not done right.
Since we're talking about things not done right, one of the things that we caution our clients whenever we're doing a contract and there are specific insurance requirements for the association to have or to cover, maybe it's an indemnity provision and the association has to indemnify under certain circumstances. We always advise the client to be sure to run that contract past their insurance agent to make sure they have the proper coverages in place. If you see insurance requirements, everybody out there in webinar land, on a particular contract, and you haven't ran those requirements past your agent, well, don't be surprised if you're somehow not in compliance with that contract because you don't have the proper coverages as required. And that can be a problem that you don't want to find out about at the worst time possible, which is after the casualty.
Jeff, that's a great point, and I know that you and I have gone down that road together where you've recommended that and I've reviewed that. The only thing I would say is what I tell boards or managers when they do send me that contract, don't just send that section of the contract. I really do need to see the whole contract.
Whole contract, of course.
I'm not gonna, I'm not an attorney. I'm not gonna step on Jeff's toes or your association attorney's toes. It's just I need to see it in context. I don't want to miss something. I don't want to find that on page 3 it said something different on page 14. I need to kind of see the whole thing.
Makes sense.
So onto another subject. So if they experience an issue, like say the issue that you brought up in the building where the electrical was ruined by the leak from a unit owner. So many people reach out for a public adjuster right away before they deal with the insurance company. Can you kind of explain why you don't want to do that and what the process should be, Brandon? Because I think people get confused on that when something happens in their house.
And before you answer, Brendan, just to say the word public adjuster, because it always confuses people. What does that mean? That's the private adjuster that you, the homeowner, are hiring, not the insurance company's adjuster. And with that as the lead in, Brendan, go for it.
Well, okay, so this one is a great question. Public adjusters absolutely have a place in the insurance world. My recommendation to my clients, and I'd recommend this to my own mother, is if you have a situation where you have a loss, you've given the insurance company a fair opportunity to come in and do the right thing there, follow the policy language and provide the coverage you're expecting. That's a perfect scenario. If you've given the insurance company the time and the information and the ability to do the right thing, and you feel like the policy supports this coverage and it should be there, but they're not covering it or they're not providing the amount that you think is fair, that's an opportunity for you to consider hiring a public adjuster. Just know that they're going to take 20% of the claim. There's a big incentive for them to drive that loss up. I'd like to say that the three of us might walk into a room that's had a pipe break and there's lots of water damage, and we might look at it and say, this is a $20,000 claim. A public adjuster is going to say it's 200,000. And I'm not exaggerating.
Did they get, when they come in, let's say that you are not happy, the insurance company gave you an award and you're not happy with it as the homeowner. So then you go to a public adjuster. Does that mean the public adjuster is getting their percentage of the entire claim or only for that second staunch, if you will?
That's very specific to the contract.
Okay.
I've seen where they're going to push to kind of even collect on what's already been given. So you have to be very careful of that.
Well, and Brandon, that's the downside when they bring them in from the start.
Right.
Because if
Right.
you bring them in from the start, they're
Right.
part of all of it.
Right. And I mean, you know, I've seen situations where it's a black or white claim. I mean, there's no gray area. I mean, it's a fire, right? You had a fire in an area. I mean, the insurance company is not going to fight you on that. I mean, that's a black and white claim. You know, I'm in the insurance industry, and I'm not going to sit here and tell all you nice people that have participated in this webinar that the insurance companies do it right all the time. They don't. They absolutely don't. But most of the time they do, and especially if you have an agent that's advocating for you, it goes well. You know, just to give everybody kind of a baseline of kind of the dark side of public adjusters, Citizens very recently, 2 weeks ago, I think it was, announced that they will no longer issue a claims check to the association and whom, if they choose representation from a public adjuster. Now the check is issued only to the association.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a big deal. Okay, because they're basically Citizens is saying to the world, and they're the first insurance company in Florida to take this position that I'm aware of. They're saying, look, you can hire whoever you want, and you know, if we end up paying money, we're going to pay to our policyholder. We don't care that you have a contract with XYZ company. That check will be issued to them in the name of our insured only. You can choose to pay them if you want. The Public Adjuster Association went bananas over this.
Sure.
I bet.
I'm sure.
I think that's very telling. Like if you know, if they feel they're not going to collect from an association that hired them. See, the problem is, the rub is that when you hire a public adjuster, one of their go-to from their playbook is to delay, and stall the claim. They'll blame the insurance company for it, but their goal is to delay the claim and give them leverage against the insurance company, because the insurance company wants to get the claim off their books. So the longer the claim goes down the road, the more leverage the public adjuster has in getting more money. So I've seen situations where a claim that should have been resolved in a matter of 3-4 months took 2 years. Meanwhile, your building is still damaged.
Jeff, do you have anything to add before I go to another area?
Not at all. Let's keep on going.
Okay, so what is the best clarification as to why an association needs workers' comp, and when should difference in conditions be offered?
So an association always needs workers' comp. It's the type of workers' comp they need is what's the question. If they have their own employees, direct employees of the association, W-2 employees of the association, then they need a workers' comp, and that workers' comp is going to be, the premium is going to be based on the payroll. There's only 2 class codes, we call them, in workers' comp for condominiums. You have 9012 and 9015. The office staff is 9012, and everybody else is 9015. And you would put the payroll on there, and then the premium. By the way, the rates for workers' comp are set by the state, so it doesn't matter what company you use. But even associations with no employees,
That's the most important.
Yes, associations that are in good hands and managed by Lang. They don't have any direct employees. They still have an exposure. They still have it. There is many scenarios where you hire this company to trim trees, for example, and let's say the contract was signed on July 1st, but they don't start until August 1st, and maybe their coverage, their workers' comp policy lapses, and somebody falls out of a tree. I can assure you that the association is going to get sued. And in that scenario, you know, by the way, the type of workers' comp policy for an association that has no direct employees is $503 a year.
Can a
Well,
homeowner, let's say you live in a single family home,
Right.
And you have people that do work. You don't know if everybody has insurance. You try to make sure everybody has their own, but all right, one gets past you. Can a homeowner such as myself buy a policy for protection so that it doesn't have to go on my the landscaper falls down off of a tree, breaks his leg. I don't want to deal with that problem. He doesn't have workers' comp because he's workers' comp exempt, which
Right.
many times we put provisions in our contracts that the contractor cannot be workers' comp exempt because we don't
Right.
want him to be exempt, because what happens if he's workers' comp exempt and gets hurt? You, the association, are going to pick up that price tag. Can a homeowner avail themselves? Is there any product out there for that?
I wish, because I would buy it in a heartbeat for
Yes.
$503. That's incredible peace of mind. Unfortunately, it's not available for homeowners, but the good news is that our clients can, Jeff. They can buy that $503 policy. Incredible peace of mind. Really, honestly, bang for your buck. The best policy the association can own. There's a lot of things that are outside of your control there.
And what's that called
And
again when the association buys that one?
So there's a couple different, it's referred to mostly as an if any policy, workers' comp, but it's an if any policy. It's basically, we don't have any employees, but if there is a situation that we're brought into, it's called employer's liability on a technical way. The workers' comp is employer's liability. So if the association's brought into it, they would be protected.
All right.
so Brandon, the other reason for that we tell the associations, there are some board members or committee members who will go do things themselves,
Right.
whether it's switching out lights, they see something in the fountain. If something happens to them, that's why I tell them you absolutely need the workers' comp policy.
Right.
For yourselves alone in a storm, if something happened, a lot of them want to clean the drain grates themselves. God forbid something happens, you want to have some type of coverage. But I want to jump back on, Jeff, where you were talking about people
Marita, let
being
me,
exempt.
I just want to say one thing before you jump is you're exactly right, but not all workers' comp, not all of the, if any, workers' comp policies for $503 have that
Mhm.
volunteer endorsement.
Okay, so they
Yeah.
need to make sure they have that.
Yes.
Okay, so that's important for
Right.
those who are on today. You really want to make sure that you have that. And it's not that much higher for the volunteer endorsement, correct, Brandon?
There's no additional premium.
Okay.
Yeah.
You just got to make sure you have it, which brings up best effort. So before we totally leave the conversation, let's make sure we talk about a condominium association board member's duty, which to procure insurance, which is to use best efforts. But I think before we get there, Marita, you started, or Brandon, someone started to ask something. No?
No, what I was saying before we jump to that,
Mhm.
so the associations who want to use Mike's mailboxes, who does not have the insurance, he wants to be exempt from the insurance, and he's going to do those mailboxes for $25 a piece versus the company that wants to do them for $100 a piece. So when they sign off on that, we as a management company, it's in our contracts that the contractors have to have insurance. They have to be covered, and it's our job to track to make sure they have it. So we've gone back to associations and said, if you decide you do not want this insurance, the board and the contractor has to sign the liability over that. We are not liable at all if somebody is hurt. And Jeff, I tell my board members, with you here on as the attorney, I said, before you ever sign a form as a board member, you want to talk to your attorney. Because if you sign that you're going to allow someone to come on without the required workman's comp and something happens to them, you could be outside the insurance coverage that you have as a board member because you allowed someone knowingly to do the work and you signed away the association's rights. I just want to be very clear because I know there's probably board members on here today who have signed those forms or said, oh, nothing's going to happen. This is just my guy, Mike. Don't worry about it. He doesn't have to have the coverage. So sorry, I drive that home, but I've seen it happen.
This is one of those things that, before I retire, I hope that me and Jeff, if you could help me, I'd love to change that wording and not call it an exemption. Because the implication there is that, we as an association are hiring this person that's exempt, and that word to some suggests that maybe they're protected as well.
Yeah, right.
And it's not. Let me promise you that exemption They are exempt from a statute in Florida that says if you employ 4 or more people, you must have workers' comp. The exemption only means that that particular company is tiny and has 3 or less people. That's
Right.
all it means.
But-
They're
And if
exempt
you're
from
exempt,
paying.
it means you, the association, are picking up the price tag if there's an injury.
Right.
Well, and the problem is that people don't understand, Brandon, when the owner of that company signs that exemption, they're only signing the exemption for themselves. So if they bring in Joey and Bob to help them
Right.
and they're hurt, the state will make sure that they're covered for workers' comp, no matter how they have to do that, whether it's the association paying for it or not. But if that individual contractor doesn't have it, they're going to find a way to get the benefits for that person who was hurt.
And by the way, Joey and Bob might be the day laborers that they picked up at a
Right.
service or at Home Depot. Like these aren't,
Right.
it could be, so they could be no relationship there.
Right.
So the risk is not worth it.
No.
Generally they're a less expensive option, but it's because they don't have the operational costs that they should have, like workers' comp.
Correct.
So let's say the association, they don't want flood coverage. They don't care about workers' comp. And that brings us back to reasonable business judgment, which is the typical standard by which a board member is judged. Did you act reasonably under the circumstances, as compared against best efforts? And if reasonable business judgment is in the middle, best efforts is at the very, very top. That means you're using your absolute best judgment. I would be reticent to be on the board of a condo where the standard for the procurement of insurance is best efforts. You got to use your best efforts to get it, and you decided not to get flood insurance. Oh my gosh. I will tee that off for you, Brandon, to talk about that just a little bit.
Well, through the difficult market, the very challenging market that we're in and have come out of, thankfully, I know that particular language was used by a very, very small percentage of associations, mostly high-rise buildings and mostly down south, Broward and Dade counties, to buy less than full property insurance. But I'm not an attorney, but that language to me doesn't say, hey, if you don't want to pay what everybody else is paying to have full coverage, we can use this best efforts language to buy $5 million worth of coverage instead of 50 million.
Well, I don't interpret it that way at all. To me, as the lawyer, I interpret it as they need the 50 million if it's available, and not
Right.
5 million, because otherwise the argument is there. They didn't use their best efforts.
Right.
They require
But-
that insurance.
And you and I are going to agree on this, but I promise you that there were associations that were using that best effort language to suggest that we did our best, but we didn't want to pay the price.
Ooh, I don't subscribe to that.
No, but we saw it. Not thankfully, it was a very low percentage. I don't want to suggest that it was out of
Right.
but
I learned that at a time not too long ago, greater than half the floods in the country occurred outside the designated flood zones. Now, maybe that's 30% now, not 50%, but I had to do some research about 20 years ago, and I was just astounded to learn, really, almost half of the floods in the country occur outside the designated flood zones. So at that point, it makes you wonder, shouldn't everybody have flood insurance? Because if you don't have it and you get wet and it comes up from the bottom, doesn't that trigger the flood policy?
yeah,
That's and just to add to that though, first, Brandon, Jeff, what a lot of people don't realize, and I say this in every hurricane meeting I attend with my associations, the hurricane, your policy for the hurricanes does not cover rising water, even if it's in a hurricane, correct, Brandon?
Right.
So,
right.
and people think they're covered because it happened during a hurricane.
That's right. And I am right now in Asheville, North Carolina. So this hits
Lucky
home.
you, it's pretty there.
It's beautiful, but you remember that it was devastated
Right.
during Hurricane Helene. and areas that, they're talking 1,000-year event in some of these areas. So never is a big word. The federal government designates low risk and high risk flood zones. Note that I did not say there's a no risk flood zone. You have low risk and high risk. After Harvey hit Houston, Texas, they went in and they did the analysis that Jeff was talking about. They got it wrong. 70% of the area flooded was low risk.
Wow.
70% of the areas flooded were told by FEMA that they were in a low risk flood area.
Well, considering the state of Florida is really swampland that's been filled in, I think you just have to be, it's absurd not to have flood insurance if it's available.
It's not that expensive, Jeff. I mean, you're talking on most homes, it's around $500 a year if you're not in a flood zone.
Right, it's the condo association where it gets a little expensive, I think.
Yeah.
No, I mean, even so, I mean, most of the high rises, for example, on the barrier islands, the flood premium can be 18 to 25,000, and they might be paying 600,000 or 700,000 for wind insurance. So, look, it's money, but I'm just saying relative to the cost of wind insurance, flood insurance is very inexpensive.
Right. So we just have a couple minutes left here before 3 o'clock. Is there anything else, Jeff, you or Brandon wanted to cover at this point that you think was important that we include as part of today? Otherwise, I can take a question off here.
Insurance agent best practices quickly to be covered by Brendan.
Best practices. So communication is key. And in my world, and honestly, I've been doing this for 26 years. And I will say that communication is even more important now because of all the work that you all are doing. It's a bad idea to assume that we know everything about your building as if we're in the boardroom with you at every meeting. We really, really need to be looped in. I really, if I'm your agent, I want to be involved with all of those high-level conversations. I want to review the language in the contracts. I want to review the certificates of insurance on the bigger projects. Really, use us. You're paying for our service. Use us. We hate learning about something when there's been a claim. Really want to know. I want to be part of the conversation.
And one thing I'd say, Brandon, especially with Plastridge Agency, and also Jeff, you're both of your firms are very accessible. I don't find any time that even if you're in a meeting, I don't get a text message back, or a response. I'll call you as soon as I can. It's important. And for any of you board members who are on here, if you're not getting responses from your agents, or your attorney, there's a reason that we're doing these association matter episodes with the companies because, they are the top companies that are out there. So I appreciate, the time and effort that you put into preparing for this and doing this for all our residents today. So thank you very much.
And we definitely value the relationship we have with Lang and of course with you, Jeff. This has been great. And I see there's a lot of questions. I'll put myself out there and if there's insurance questions that I can respond to that didn't get responded to, I'd be glad to do so after the meeting, make sure everybody is heard and gets their answer.
And I want to thank everybody that put the questions in because we use those to guide our way through today's webinar and so many of the others. So keep the questions coming in.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Everyone have a good afternoon. Thank you for attending today.
Pray for no storms. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yes. No
Thanks.
storms.